Greetings from Group 2, preparing for Week 10 ahead. Group 2, Jennifer, Anit, and I, Faiza, are pleased to present our topic, Prospective Research Design. In the following slides, we've created a mixed media learning experience for you. You'll find this voiced-over script, suggested readings, and short videos that walk you through an example research question focused on children, a topic that's meaningful to each of us. Jennifer and Anit bring the perspective of parenting young children, while I've had the privilege of working with children throughout my career. We hope you enjoy the class discussion questions that follow, and we look forward to thoughtful, engaging conversations with all of you in the coming week. This page gives you a roadmap of our presentation and what to expect. We'll begin by introducing the concept of prospective research design, what it is and when it's used, before connecting it to our example research question. We'll then take a closer look at the strengths and limitations of this design, including what makes it valuable and what challenges researchers may face when using it. Next, we'll walk through a specific example. We'll outline the key components, such as the intervention, influencing variable, and the basic study design. From there, we'll explore potential threats to validity, for example, attrition, measurement bias, observer bias, and confounding variables, each illustrated through our example. We'll then highlight the core assumptions that guide prospective research, including maintaining a clear timeline, consistent follow-up, and reliable measurement practices. And finally, we'll wrap up with some reflections on applying this approach in the real world, using our early childhood literacy study to bring everything together. By the end, you should have a good understanding of prospective research design and how it works in both theory and real-life situations. Let's get started by exploring the key elements of prospective research design. Prospective research is a longitudinal approach that follows participants over time to observe how specific exposures, experiences, or interventions influence outcomes. The study begins in the present and collects data as it unfolds, allowing researchers to track development, change, or progression over multiple time points. This approach is often used to explore causal relationships, identify risk factors, or evaluate the long-term impact of interventions. And because data is collected in real time, prospective studies help reduce recall bias and clarify the timeline between the exposure and outcome. And however, they do come with some challenges like participant dropout and the need for long-term resources. Today, we'll take a closer look at how this design works and why it's especially relevant to our chosen example research question. Our presentation has three main objectives. First, we will explain the key features of prospective research design. This includes understanding when and why it's used, its core assumptions, and the threats to validity that researchers need to consider. Second, we will critically evaluate the strengths and limitations of this design. We'll explore how it supports strong causal inferences, while also recognizing the challenges such as time commitment, resource demands, and the potential for bias. And third, we'll apply prospective research methods to a practical question using an example on early childhood literacy and parental socioeconomic status, and we'll walk through how design choices play out in practice and how challenges can be addressed during implementation. The example research question that anchors this week's discussion with respect to prospective research design is, to what extent does parental socioeconomic status, or SES, moderate the effect of an early childhood reading program on children's language and literacy development over time? In other words, we're exploring whether the impact of the reading program differs based on the family's socioeconomic background and how those effects unfold as children grow. Let's first take a moment to talk about why you would use prospective cohort design. A prospective study follows a group of individuals over time, collecting data on their exposures and tracking how outcomes develop. This longitudinal approach is especially useful when we want to understand the long-term effects of a treatment, intervention, or risk factor. In our case, we're interested in how a reading program influences children's language and literacy development over time. A prospective cohort design allows us to measure outcomes at multiple time points and link them back to the program participation and socioeconomic factors. This design also gives us a stronger argument for causality than a retrospective or a case control study would. And while those designs rely on past data or pre-identified conditions, prospective cohort studies observe changes as they unfold, helping us better understand how and why outcomes occur. For example, the ABCD study by Brown and colleagues is the largest ongoing prospective study on brain development that's following over 10,000 children from childhood into adulthood, and it's examining the factors that shape development across cognitive, emotional, social, and physical domains, and it's a great model for how powerful this design can be. Prospective research is the most commonly used in cohort studies where a group of participants is followed over time, but it's not limited to cohort studies. You can also use a prospective approach in other designs like a case series or quasi-experiments, as long as you're collecting data going forward in time, and the key feature is tracking participants over time to observe how things change. Let's look at why prospective research design is considered so strong. First, it helps reduce recall bias because data is collected as events happen, so participants don't have to rely on memory, and that leads to more accurate and consistent information. Second, prospective studies establish a clear timeline, which makes it easier to show that the exposure occurred before the outcome, and this supports stronger conclusions about causality. Third, researchers have control over how data is collected, which improves the quality of the data overall. There's also flexibility. We can adjust the focus, add variables, or look more closely at subgroups as the study progresses. So a prospective cohort study can be a better choice, for example, than a randomized controlled trial in situations where it would be unethical to expose people to something that might negatively affect their health. And finally, we can observe multiple outcomes from a single exposure, which increases the efficiency and value of the research. Although prospective research design offers strong advantages, they also come with trade-offs we need to consider because of how they're designed. First, they are time-consuming. These studies follow participants over a long period, so it can take months or even years before we reach meaningful conclusions. They can be especially challenging when studying outcomes that develop slowly or are rare. And they can be costly. Because of the extended timeline, prospective studies often require ongoing staffing, special data systems, and participant follow-up, which makes them more expensive than other study designs. Another issue is participant dropout. So over time, people may move away or lose interest or withdraw for personal reasons. When a large number of participants leave, it can affect the study results and lower its internal validity. Prospective studies may also not be the best option for rare outcomes, and these outcomes often require large sample sizes and long follow-up times, which can be difficult to manage. Lastly, without randomization, there is still a risk of selection bias or unmeasured confounding variables influencing the results. Hamoude and colleagues state that even with careful planning, certain groups may be over or underrepresented. So, although prospective designs are a strong option, often just behind randomized controlled trials in terms of reliability, it's important to weigh these limitations when planning a study. To support your understanding of the example research question we're using throughout this presentation, we'd like to take a moment to explore how some methods and participants apply. This added context outlined in the next slide will make it easier to connect the question to the key concepts we'll be discussing. So in this example study, our intervention would be participation in a structured early childhood reading program. We would examine the role of parental SES as a moderator. A moderator is a variable that influences the strength or direction of the relationship between two other variables. In this case, we're interested in the program's is whether the program's impact differs for children from low versus high SES backgrounds. And the outcome we're measuring is children's language and literacy development over time. To explore this, we could use a longitudinal quasi-experimental design, so no random assignment, and this design would allow us to examine whether parental SES affects the relationship between participation in the reading program and children's literacy outcomes. A longitudinal approach is well suited for this research because it allows a researcher to track development changes and growth over multiple time points. As well, we would gather informed consent. So for studies involving young children, consent must be obtained from a parental or legal guardian. And this process includes clearly explaining the study's purpose, what participation involves, potential risks and benefits, how the data will be used, and the right to withdraw at any time without consequence. Ongoing communication is important, especially for long-term studies, to ensure participants continue to feel informed and supported throughout. Our example participants would include children between the ages of 3 and 5 who are enrolled in early childhood education programs, along with their parents or primary caregivers. We would identify 2 groups based on program participation, so an intervention group of children who take part in the early reading program and a comparison group of children who do not. However, the main focus of our study is to examine how parental SES influences the relationship between the program participation and children's language and literacy over time. And to ensure a diverse and representative sample, we could alternatively use a stratified sampling method. In a stratified sampling method, you're breaking down your population into meaningful subgroups or strata, and then taking a random sample from each of those groups. And the goal is to make sure all key segments of the population are fairly representative in the study. For example, in our research question on early childhood reading programs, we want to make sure we include children from both high and low parental SES backgrounds. So we would divide our population into 2 groups based on SES, high and low, and then randomly select participants from within each of those groups. So this helps to ensure that one SES group isn't over or underrepresented in our sample, which would strengthen the validity of our results. In terms of our data collection timeline, we would consider gathering data at 3 distinct time points. T1 will occur at baseline, just before at the very beginning of the reading program. T2 would be post-intervention or at the end of a preschool year, for example. And T3 would be follow-up assessment taking place 1 or 2 years later during early elementary school. This timeline allows us to assess both short-term and longer-term effects of the program on literacy development. And if we were to carry out the study, we'd consider 3 key areas for data collection. So the first one is language and literacy outcomes. We were thinking about using things like standardized reading tests, teacher reports, and structured classroom observations. For parental SES, parents could complete a survey on income, education, employment, to help us track, sort of an overall SES score. And then for program participation, we'd track attendance and use fidelity checklists to monitor how consistently the reading program is being delivered. Now that we've outlined the research design, let's shift our focus to some key questions that can affect the validity of a prospective study. Even with a strong design in place, there are several challenges that can comprise the accuracy, credibility, and generalizability of our results. In the next few slides, we'll walk through common threats to validity in prospective research, including attrition, measurement bias, observer bias, confounding variables, and time-related changes. For each one, we'll look at what it is, why it matters, and how it might show up in the context of our proposed example on early childhood reading program study. Understanding these threats is essential not only to strengthen the study design, but also to critically interpret findings from other research. Let's take a moment to refresh ourselves about 3 specific types of validity in research: internal, external, and construct validity. First, internal validity is about how confident we can be that the changes we see in our outcomes are actually due to our intervention or exposure and not because some other factor. For example, if children in our reading study improve their literacy skills, we need to rule out other explanations like extra tutoring at home or differences in school support. So a high internal validity means we've controlled for these alternative explanations as much as possible. Next is external validity, which is all about generalizability. Even if our study shows a strong effect, we need to ask, will this result hold true for other groups of children in other communities or in different settings? So if our sample is too narrow, for instance, only children from high SES families, let's say, then our findings might not apply to children in other circumstances. The third type is construct validity, which refers to whether we're actually measuring what we're saying we're measuring. So in our study, if we claim to measure language development, we need to make sure our assessment tools truly reflect that construct and not something different, like general cognitive ability or attention span. And if the tools don't match the concept, then our conclusions could be misleading. So together, these three types of validity help us evaluate how strong, accurate, and meaningful our research findings really are. And we will now explore some of these. In prospective studies, one of the most common threats to validity is selection bias. This happens when participants are not randomly selected or when certain groups are more likely to participate than others. As a result, the findings may not generalize well to the broader population. Stenson and Kepler in 2019 outlined two key sources of this type of bias. The first is enrollment and retention bias. And so although prospective studies begin with participants enrolled before the outcome develops, uneven dropout across the groups can lead to skewed samples and unreliable conclusions over time. And then the second is related to inclusion criteria and sampling methods. So if your inclusion criteria aren't clearly defined, or if you rely on convenience sampling, your groups may end up differing in important ways that have nothing to do with the intervention. And this threatens internal validity. In our assigned course textbook by Bhattacharjee, they describe convenience sampling as a type of non-probability sampling where researchers select participants who are easiest to access or recruit, such as people who are, close by or readily available or willing to participate. And so confounding by indication is a type of selection bias that happens when the reason or indication for assigning a treatment or intervention is related to the outcome being studied. Basically, it means that people are not randomly assigned to a treatment. They're given the treatment because of a specific reason, like having more severe symptoms. But that reason itself, like illness severity, for example, could also affect the outcome, which can make it harder to tell whether the treatment actually worked. So bringing this back to our research question, if we're studying whether a reading program improves literacy and only children who are already struggling are placed in the program, their poorer outcomes later might reflect their original difficulties, not whether the program was effective. So in this case, the indication, so low literacy, confounds the results because it influences both the selection for the program and the literacy outcome. If the majority of children enrolled in our early childhood reading program come from highly engaged or higher SES families, and less engaged or lower SES families are underrepresented, then we risk overestimating the program's true impact. And in that case, improvements in literacy outcomes may represent pre-existing family involvement, not the effectiveness of the program itself. That's why it's important that we focus on a carefully designed recruitment strategy with clear and inclusive criteria and proactive measures to minimize dropout over time. These steps are essential to reducing selection bias and ensuring that our findings are both valid and generalizable to the broader population of interest. Now let's talk about attrition, one of the biggest threats to validity in longitudinal studies. Attrition refers to the loss of participants over time. In a prospective multi-time point study like this one, it's common for some families to drop out before the final follow-up. And while some attrition is expected, it becomes a problem when it's not random. So for example, if lower SES families are more likely to drop out, perhaps due to transportation or competing priorities or lack of trust in research, our final sample may overrepresent high SES families. And this would skew the results and make it harder to assess whether the reading program works equally well across different SES groups. Attrition doesn't just reduce sample size, it introduces systemic bias and weakens our ability to generalize the findings. It also reduces the statistic power of our analysis. So to address this, it's important to have a retention strategy in place from the start. In 1993, a study by Kristen Gustafson. 913 mothers of 18-month-old children were enrolled in a long-term study on child and family development. After 15 years, 56% had dropped out, and the study explored factors that predicted attrition and compared baseline data between those who stayed and those who left. Gustafson's work highlighted effective retention strategies such as regular follow-up, flexible scheduling, and small incentives, which are broadly applicable to prospective research. So the goal is to minimize dropout, ensure that our sample remains as balanced and representative as possible across all time points. Another important concern in this type of research is measurement bias. This occurs when the tools or methods we use to collect data systematically distorts the results. In our study, measurement bias could arise if the language and literacy assessments aren't equally valid across all SES backgrounds. For example, if a test includes vocabulary or experiences that are more familiar to high SES children, then children from low SES families might score lower, even if their actual language development is on track. In this case, we wouldn't be measuring literacy accurately, we'd be capturing a difference in exposure, not ability. Measurement bias can also occur if people administering the assessments are not consistent, or if parents interpret SES survey questions differently based on, cultural norms or language barriers. So to reduce this risk, we'll need to use well-validated, age-appropriate tools and ensure that all assessors are trained and follow standardized procedures as suggested in a case study from the UK reported by John Jerram on measurement error in preschool children's emerging knowledge and skills. For our particular study example, we could also consider using alternative assessments or parent-reported measures that are accessible to families across different backgrounds. So minimizing measurement bias also helps to ensure that our findings reflect true differences in development, not differences in how the data were collected. Now, let's talk about observer bias, which can be especially relevant when researchers or educators are responsible for rating or observing participants. Observer bias can occur when the person collecting the data is influenced by their own expectations or assumptions. In our study, this could happen if assessors know which children participated in the reading program and expect those children to perform better. Even unintentionally, they might rate those children as more focused, more verbal, or more engaged, regardless of what the child is actually doing. This bias can also show up in relation to socioeconomic status. So if the observer is aware of a family's SES background, it might affect how they interpret the child's communication skills or learning behavior even without meaning to. There's also something called the Hawthorne effect, which happens when participants change their behavior simply because they know they're being observed. So in our case, a child might appear more focused or cooperative during an assessment, not because of the reading program, but because they're aware someone is watching them. And this can blur the true impact of the intervention. The problem with observer bias and the Hawthorne effect is that they threaten the accuracy and objectivity of the data. It means we're no longer measuring the child's actual development, we're measuring the observer's expectation or the child's response to being observed. To prevent this, we can use several strategies. One is to have assessors who are blind to the group assignment, so they don't know which children were in the intervention. Another is to use standardized observation tools with clear criteria. We can also check for inter-rater reliability to make sure different observers are interpreting behaviors in the same way. And these steps help reduce observer bias, which is a type of information bias, a broader category of bias that occurs when data collected about participants is systemically inaccurate. These steps help ensure that our findings are based on what's really happening and not on what to expect or hope to see. Now let's turn to confounding variables. These are factors that are related to both the intervention and the outcome, and they can distort the relationship we're trying to study. In our case, we want to know whether participation in an early childhood reading program improves language and literacy outcomes and whether the effect is moderated by parental SES. But other variables may also influence these outcomes. For example, children who are enrolled in the program might also come from homes where parents regularly read to them or where there are more books and language-rich activities. If we don't account for these kind of factors, it becomes hard to know whether the improvement in literacy is due to the program itself or the child's home environment. And that's a classic example of confounding variable. Other possible confounders might include the child's baseline language ability, teacher quality, or prior exposure to learning program outcomes. To reduce the risk of confounding, we'll need to collect solid baseline data on relevant child and family characteristics. Then we can statistically control for those variables in the analysis. And this helps isolate the effect of the reading program and gives us a clearer picture of what's really driving the outcomes we observe. So by accounting for confounders, we can strengthen the internal validity of our study and make more accurate claims about the impact of the intervention. Let's talk about time-related changes. In any longitudinal study, especially one involving young children, we need to account for the fact that development is happening all the time, whether or not an intervention is taking place. Children naturally improve their language and literacy skills as they grow older. They also experience a range of influences over time, like new teachers, different classroom settings, and life events outside of school. And all of these can affect learning and development. In our study example, if we see improvements in children's literacy outcomes over time, we need to ask, are these improvements due to the reading program itself, or are they simply the result of typical development progress or other experiences that occurred during that time? This is why including a comparison like a comparison group is essential. So by comparing children who participate in the program with those who do not, we can better understand whether the observed changes are actually related to the intervention. We also plan to control for age and use multiple time points in our analysis. This allows us to separate normal development trends from the effects of the reading program itself. So accounting for time-related changes is important to avoid overstating the impact of the intervention and to ensure that our findings reflect real program effects, not just passage of time. Now, let's shift to assumptions. In prospective research, certain assumptions must hold for the study to produce valid results. First, the cause or intervention must happen before the outcome, establishing a clear temporal relationship. Second, participants should be followed consistently over time using the same methods to ensure reliable comparisons. Measurements need to be accurate and reliable to truly affect what we want to study. Exposure status should remain stable. Participants in the intervention should continue receiving it, and comparison groups should not receive similar treatments. Dropouts should occur randomly, not systematically, so as to avoid bias. And finally, we must control for confounding variables, participant independence, external factors, and stability that could affect both the intervention and outcomes. So meeting these assumptions is essential for drawing meaningful conclusions about the effect of the reading program. Let's begin with one of the most fundamental assumptions in prospective research, the assumption of a temporal relationship. This means that the cause must come before the effect. In other words, to argue that the reading program influenced children's language and literacy development, the program has to take place before we measure any outcomes. This seems straightforward, but it's important when we're trying to make causal inferences. So if we measure outcomes before the intervention or at the same time, we can't be sure whether the changes we observe were caused by the program or if they were already present. Our longitudinal design helps us meet this assumption by collecting baseline data first, then introducing the reading program, and then measuring outcomes at 2 later time points. And this allows us to track changes over time and establish that the exposure, in this case the program participation, happened before any observed changes in literacy skills. Without a clear temporal sequence, that is the order in which events unfold over time, our ability to interpret results as reading program effects would be significantly weakened. Another key assumption in prospective and longitudinal research is consistency in follow-up. This means that all participants should be followed over time using the same procedures at the same intervals and with the same measurement tools. This consistency helps to ensure that any differences we see in outcomes are not due to changes in how or when the data was collected. So in our study, if one group of children is assessed more frequently or at different time points than another, that could introduce inconsistencies that make the data difficult to compare. So for example, children who are followed closely may appear to improve more but that may simply reflect more frequent measurement, not the effect of the reading program itself. So to uphold this assumption, we'll plan our data collection schedule carefully and use the same tools at each time point. And this will help us accurately track development changes and reduce the risk of bias related to inconsistent data collection. Maintaining consistency and follow-up is essential to preserve the integrity of the study and to make valid comparisons across groups and over time. The next assumption is accurate and reliable measurement. This means that the tools we use to collect data must consistently and accurately measure what we intend them to. So in our study, that includes literacy assessments, classroom observations, and parent-reported SES. If these tools are poorly designed or used inconsistently, our findings may reflect measurement error rather than true differences in, child development or program impact. So, for example, if one teacher uses a checklist that rates language use differently than another, we might see differences in scores that are really just due to the data, like how the data was collected, and not how the child is doing. And similarly, if parents interpret SES survey questions differently, that could affect how SES is classified and can distort the analysis. So to maintain accuracy and reliability, we'll use validated standardized tools for all key measurements. And we would also provide training for assessors and observers to ensure procedures are applied consistently across all settings and time points. So accurate and reliable measurement is foundational to the success of a prospective study. This allows us to detect real change, compare groups fairly, and draw valid conclusions from the results. Another key assumption in prospective research is that the exposure status remains stable throughout the study period. In our case, exposure refers to whether or not a child participated in early reading program. For the analysis to be valid, we need this status to remain consistent over time. So children in the intervention group should continue to receive the program as planned, and those in the comparison group should not receive a similar intervention program elsewhere. So if a child begins in the comparison group but later joins a different literacy program, or if a family in the intervention group stops participating halfway through, that introduces variability that can affect the interpretation of our findings. It becomes harder to attribute any observed changes in literacy development specifically to the original program. And so to address this, we would monitor participation closely using attendance records and program logs, and we could also define what counts as exposed. For example, a child must attend like a minimum number of sessions to be considered part of the intervention program. If needed, we can conduct sensitivity analysis to show how stable or inconsistent exposure might impact the results. Song and Chung describe ensuring stable exposure status helps maintain the integrity of group comparisons and supports valid conclusions about the program's effectiveness. The next assumption we must consider is no systemic dropout. This means that participants who drop out of the study do so randomly and not in a way that is related to important variables like SES, participation in the reading program, or their language and literacy development. If dropout happens systematically, for example, if families with lower SES are more likely to leave the study, then our sample at later time points will not accurately represent the original group. This can bias the results and limit how well the findings can be generalized. Systemic dropout can reduce the validity of our conclusions because it changes the composition of the sample in ways that might be related to the outcomes that we're trying to study. So to minimize this, we will implement strong retention strategies such as regular communication and incentives. We would also carefully monitor dropout patterns and use statistical methods to adjust for any biases that might arise. So ensuring that dropout is not systematic helps maintain the credibility and applicability of the study findings. Next, we focus on controlling for confounding factors. So confounding factors are variables that are related both to whether a child participates in the reading program and to their language and literacy outcomes. If we don't account for these variables, we risk attributing effects to the program that are actually due to other influences. So in our study, potential confounders might include the home literacy environment or the child's baseline language skills, and parental involvement in learning activities. So to address this, we would collect data at like baseline data on these factors, and then during analysis, we would use the statistical methods such as regression models to control for the influence of confounders. And this would help isolate the true effect of the reading program. So by carefully controlling for confounding factors, we increase the accuracy of our findings and strengthen the validity of our conclusions about the program's impact. Next is participant independence, and this assumption covers two important ideas. First, we want our participants to begin the study from a similar starting point or baseline, and this was also described in an article by Markham and colleagues in 2023. This way we can better understand how the intervention is affecting them without too many outside differences getting in the way. Second, it's important that each participant takes part independently. If participants or are classmates or friends or siblings, there's a chance that, they could influence each other's progress. So, for example, one child might copy another or learn from them instead of the program itself. So, allowing participants to complete the study independently helps to ensure that their results reflect their own experience and not someone else's. And so, if we don't follow this, the results can get skewed, and the study becomes less reliable. Stable external factors refers to the idea that the environment around participants should stay relatively consistent during the study. This includes things like school policies, community programs, or family routines, for example. And when these external conditions remain stable, it helps to ensure that any changes we observe in outcomes are more likely due to the intervention itself rather than outside influences. And if major changes happen during the study, such as a new school curriculum or a province-wide reading initiative, for example, they could all impact participants and influence the results. So, for example, if we're studying the effects of an early reading program over 2 years and partway the school board introduces a new literacy-based curriculum or reading app access, it could improve reading outcomes for all students. And this would make it harder to tell whether the gains came from the reading program or from the new initiative. And this ties into the idea of stable exposure, which means that the program or intervention should have similar impact across all participants. If new literacy supports are introduced outside of the program, it may be difficult to isolate the specific effect of the reading program. So recognizing both of these assumptions early, keeping external conditions stable and ensuring consistent exposure helps strengthen the design of the study and protects the accuracy of the findings. Tiny voices, big learning. Before we wrap up, we wanted to share something fun and heartwarming. On the next 2 slides, you'll see short videos of Jen's and Anit's 3-year-old sons in action, practicing their phonics skills. These clips bring our research topic to life and remind us of the real-world impact early literacy programs can have, even in the smallest voices. We hope you enjoy this.
B, A, B, B, Y.
And what does that say?
Puppy. 1, 2,
2,
B,
3.
bo, e, go, e, duck, e, a, b.
In conclusion, prospective research design is a longitudinal approach that allows researchers to observe outcomes as they unfold over time. It's especially useful for studying cause and effect relationships, identifying risk factors, or evaluating the long-term impact of an intervention. One of its key strengths is strong temporal validity. Because data is collected in real time, it helps reduce recall bias and supports clearer inferences about causality. However, prospective studies also come with challenges, and they often require significant time and resources and are at risk for participant dropout, which can affect the quality of the data. That's why it's it's important to understand not just when to use the design, but also how to apply it effectively. This includes recognizing its core assumptions, planning for potential limitations, and building in strategies to manage them. With thoughtful planning and real-world application, prospective research can provide meaningful and lasting insights across a wide range of fields. Thank you for listening. To support this week's class discussion on prospective research design, we've included a few brief but important resources for you to explore in advance. Start by reading the article by Zuhair, Longitudinal Prospect Cohort Studies, a Research Method Primer. This short piece offers a clear, accessible overview of what prospective cohort studies are, how they're used, and why they matter. It's a good foundation for our topic. Next, we invite you to read the longitudinal study by Shahan et al., which examines how early shared reading and socioeconomic status relate to children's development over a 6-year period. This article directly connects with our example research question and provides sort of a realistic context for applying prospective methods. Then watch a quick YouTube video by Dr. Joko Gunawan titled Prospective Cohort Study Explained. It's less than 2 minutes long, and it gives a simple breakdown of how this type of study works, especially useful if you're like a visual learner. And then as an optional but highly recommended addition, we've included a TED Talk by Kimberly Noble, How Does Income Affect Childhood Brain Development? It's an 11-minute video that dives into the relationship between income inequality and child development, offering, a powerful perspective that relates to our discussion of SES as an influencing variable. Please try to review these materials before our discussion. They'll hopefully help you deepen your understanding and give you some great ideas to contribute to our conversation. Now that you've had a chance to review the slideshow and supporting materials, we'd like to open things up for some discussion. We've put together 3 questions to help you reflect more deeply on key concepts and apply them to practical research context. First, let's think about ethics. So after reviewing the slideshow, what ethical considerations should researchers keep in mind when conducting longitudinal studies with young children and families, especially when working with families from a range of socioeconomic backgrounds? You're welcome to draw from the example we used in our presentation, or feel free to reflect on your own experiences if something comes to mind. Next, let's revisit the Zuhair article. So based on what you read, what would you say are the key strengths and challenges of using prospective research design? So try to include an example, maybe from a study you've seen or from your own professional or personal experience that connects to this kind of research approach. And then finally, let's talk about bias. Using the Shahin article, this discussion is optional, but we'd love to hear your thoughts if you have time to join in. This study focused on sharing reading and school outcomes over time. So what kinds of validity issues might influence the results of this study on shared reading and achievement, and how could those biases influence the findings? So take a few moments to think about each of these, and we'll invite you to share your insights with the group. Your experiences and reflections really will really help bring these concepts to life, and we're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts this week. Thank you. We've included full citations for all the sources mentioned throughout our presentation, including the readings, articles, and videos. These references are great resources if you'd like to explore prospective research design in more depth or revisit any of these studies we discussed. Feel free to refer back to them as you continue developing your own research ideas.